Welcome back to Conversations for the Good. Good afternoon, Dr. Jane.
Hi, Anna. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. You know, Dr. Jane, you've talked about the brain's role in thinking and how it works to keep us safe by interpreting situations and creating context, which is based on past experiences and beliefs. I was hoping that today we could dive more deeply into the thinking.
Well, I think that's a great idea, Anna. I want to say as kind of an introduction to it, is that it really brings in kind of a debate that has been going on for several years now in the neuroscience community. Because when we talk about thinking, we're really talking about two dimensions, two phenomena. You know, one is the brain and the other is the mind. And what I want to do is just kind of give a little information here. Not too much, but just something that will support what we're going to be talking about. When we talk about the brain, we're talking about really a physical source of processing, kind of a central processing unit, processing by electrical signals. And it's processing the content of the mind, which includes thoughts, includes feelings, includes attitudes, beliefs, memories, even imagination. And then we also have the mind, which is a non-physical source, okay? It's kind of like a train that runs 24/7 behind the scenes, always processing and interpreting information. Information that really is about our direct experiences in the world, but also takes into account the things that the brain has been processing as well. So it's taking in and interpreting, again, thoughts and feelings, memories, beliefs, all of that. And this ongoing interpretation is connected to our reactivity. So we have the brain and we have the mind all working together, but is directly connected to reactivity. And what's interesting about the mind is that we can actually access the mind, know what's going on in the mind through present moment awareness. Through present moment awareness, we can recognize and turn toward what we're thinking in the moment as we're thinking it. So this all plays into what we very often call autopilot thinking. And this is something that I learned back in graduate school, first with a fellow by the name of Albert Ellis, who developed a model called rational motor therapy. And what he said is that we can change how we feel, and we can change our behavior merely by changing our thought process. And he was one of the first people that I ever heard that talked about this ABCs of thinking, which really kind of breaks it down into how we create this autopilot interpretation and response to the world that becomes very, very subjective. It's really about our experiences and our past.
Wow, this is very interesting. Sounds like it's going to be a straightforward thing here.
Well, it is pretty straightforward, Anna, and that's why we're going to drop into a graphic now as we talk about it. Because when we talk about the ABCs of thinking, we're talking about, first of all, the A tends to be that activating event. That's usually something that is external. It's something that we can observe. And as we observe it, we're interpreting something. But the A all by itself has a neutral balance. Okay, it's not plus or minus, it's just kind of an activity that's going on. It'd be like taking a video of something that is happening. That's the A. And then we have the B, and the B is the interpretation that we give to A. And the interpretation would be kind of like the subtitles or the voiceover, something like that, okay, to the activity, all right? So it really is about the interpretation or the explanation we're giving to it. And then we have C, which stands for consequence, or that's the consequence or the emotion or reactivity that comes from the interpretation, or B, that we give what's happening in A. I know this can sound kind of confusing, but it really does follow. We have the activating event, and then we have our interpretation of the activating event and the resulting emotions, our reactivity. Interestingly enough, we very often are clear in knowing what's going on in A. We can see that and observe that. And also I can become fairly aware that I'm in a reactive state. But what we don't often know what's happening is with that B, what's driving this interpretation? What's really behind what's going on? Because it's the B that really is triggering the resulting emotion, not the A, but my interpretation of the A. And I call this the backstory. But most of us think that A, the activating event, is triggering the emotion, which really isn't so. It's the backstory that gives all the trigger and all the influence to our response. But our language supports that A and C are the two that count. We have things like we say, I've got the Monday blahs, like something about Monday is directly tied into my blah. Yeah.
Yeah. Or like, I can't believe he or she said that, or.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So we see the world through these filters of our beliefs, our cumulative history, our conditioning, all the things that happen to us as part of our collective history is really part of our collective backstory. All of it plays into this. And I very often use the analogy of reading glasses. Because we put on reading glasses, I have these glasses on, because I want to see the world more clearly. And the way that I see the world is I have these frames, and the frames represent the socialization and the conditioning, the things we were taught that were modeled for us in our developing experience, in that early childhood experience, and as we were growing up and really cultivating who we are via the environments that surrounded us. So that's really the frames. And then the lenses tend to be our personal experience of the world. You know, how I take in that, regardless of my backstory, how I take in a personal experience and how that influences me. And all of this plays into how I'm experiencing something in the moment.
So these are really all things that we learned early in our lives. I mean, this is huge. I mean, for most people, it can be difficult for us to remember all the details.
Well, that's an interesting part of this, Anna, is we don't remember often, and some of us have, we have vague notions of the past. Another population that probably is more keen on what happened in the past are people who have had significant trauma or were in war zones or were in survival situations where they had to tune in to the minute details of what was going on at the time because things were dangerous or there were feelings of an incredible lack of safety or security. But for most of us, everything in our past is kind of a blend. We might have certain things that stand out, but on a whole, it all kind of, meshes together. It all just kind of blends. And so it's no wonder that we think that something out there is the culprit because we're not really keenly aware of this backstory that's playing into it. It's the background music. And yet it's influencing everything that happens. And it happens so quickly that sometimes we're not able to sort out, fact from fiction. So it continues to just kind of roll along. And once it starts rolling, it's hard to slow down and certainly hard to stop. And it's kind of like a rumor mill, or at worst, it could be kind of like a propaganda stream. We're unable to hear what's going on, and yet it's influencing how we operate in the world. And we're unable to very often take in anyone who has a different interpretation. We're not able to hear it, or we can't because we can't align ourselves with it. We're so permeated with what our backstory is that we just can't move it forward. Yeah.
Wow, this is incredibly powerful. The bee does certainly sound like it runs the show.
It does run the show, yes. Yeah. And it's hard to discern the truth when we're really anchored in that. And, so anchored in it that even when something different or opposes that belief system happens down the road, sometimes it's hard to wrap our heads around it. We just can't see it for what it is.
Yeah. So, Dr. Jane, the backstory takes form in our socialization, and then we look for occurrences in the world to justify our story, correct?
That's exactly.
So an example would be like the pandemic.
Well, the pandemic is a wonderful example of this. I mean, we have the contradictory news reports. We have the whole piece of the, you know, information from the CDC and the general population finding it, unacceptable. We have, all kinds of news reports that really cultivate and perpetuate the fear that was already prevalent. And then we also have, as people are taking this in, depending on their backstory, depending on their frames, depending on their frames and their lenses, really kind of taking this in and choosing sides. It's like, what aligns with me? What is most, similar to what I'm already anchored in? And people are reacting according to their backstory. But what I also find a point of interest is that for many people, they already have a solidified backstory. So the pandemic is really, for many of us, it's like a new experience. We're taking it through our lenses. It doesn't fit with our backstory. So it's like, how do I juggle this? How do I know what side to choose? Mm-hmm. And yet there's another whole population who are in their developmental processes right now, where the pandemic is really part of their frame. It will be part of how they always see the world. It's an early experience that will be integrated into their backstory.
Wow, that's amazing. Now I see so much of the negativity. Is there a way that this can happen in a positive way?
Oh, sure. For many of us, part of our early beliefs and conditioning and accumulation with history really had positive notes to it. Mm-hmm. Things like, our preferences, tastes that were acquired, regional kind of foods that we're attracted to, something as simple as the brand of soft drinks that our family chose as the kind of toothpaste really become kind of integrated into that backstory. Our attitudes about people, how we kind of frame people as being positive or negative. Also, which population or which group of people deserve me being positive toward them. That's all part of this backstory. It can certainly have a positive tone as we seek out things that we enjoy and things that, really kind of elevate our moods. And yet the thing to remember is that the mind, and this comes out of the mind piece very often, the mind is part of the survival system. So it's going to be looking for what's wrong. Where's the danger? And this tends to intensify when we're at a lower energy or feel at all stressed or threatened. Those environments we've talked about in the past where we become, hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, or have prolonged stress, that very often, lowers our resistance. And so we're not going to feel positiveness. We're going to kind of be focused more on, what's wrong? Where is the danger?
Yeah, you've said it before, negativity breeds negativity.
Yes, Anna, and there's another dimension worth noting here, and that is as we are in prolonged stress and as our resistance is lowered, our perceptual filters are also altered. When I'm feeling positive and I'm feeling energized and buoyant, my filters very often are very, very solid, and something negative comes in, and I can say, nah, I'm not going to let that bother me, or I can kind of defend myself against it. But when my energy is down, when I'm under a lot of stress, my resistance is lowered. And so my perceptual filters become almost like a sieve. And it's like the negative just kind of comes in, and I take it as a direct hit again and again, which continues to lower my resistance, tends to lower my ability to defend in a positive way, and really supports that kind of developing negativity, and certainly ties into any kind of negative backstory that might be there to say that, here you go again. What did you expect? There it is.
Yeah. So this is what's happening to us on the outside world, I guess I should say, right? So this is what's happening to us in the outside world. Knowing you, Dr. Jane, I know that there's probably something to be said about what's happening inside of each of us.
Well, our inner world, it's created by our early experiences. Years from infancy to 4 is where we develop a foundation, and certainly it's solidified by age 7. So in our families, in our relationships, in our schools, in our communities, our ethnic and religious influences all play into this accumulative history. And so this is creating the inner world, our sense of confidence, our sense of taking care of myself, the do's and don'ts of what it is to be a good person or a successful person or a responsible person, all happens out of this backstory that's being cultivated early on in our lives. And this includes what we were told, but also what was modeled. I think of that saying, do what I say, not what I do.
Yes.
Well, very often, as children, we're observing that what you're doing might not be aligned with what you're saying. And that also becomes part of what we internalize. That becomes part of our backstory. So this is all our socialization, social and moral development that we're taught early on. And for most of us, it was, we had our caregivers giving us direct orders to behave in a civilized manner. And for God's sake, suppress those unacceptable urges, right? For our own safety and security, but also for their culture, for their comfort. It really is about early on, it was about keeping the adults in our environment very, very comfortable. Basic training for Western culture.
Yes, that's what it sounds like. Well, so much of this, took place so early in our lives, and I'm listening to you as I'm recognizing how I passed it on to my son, as well. So starting from when he was very young.
We all did it, Anna. We all did it. And it reminds me of this wonderful book by Miguel Ruiz called The Four Agreements. And he talks about this early conditioning. He refers to it as the domestication of humans. And what he says is that we have really internalized and cultivated these agreements that were part of our surroundings, that impacted us, and we've internalized long before we knew what we were agreeing to. And it becomes kind of a law or a book of law in the way we live. And for most of us, this also is what forms what I call an inner critic or an inner judge, which is how we develop a sense of consciousness, and conscience. But this can really kind of run amok because we can become very, very rigid and unbending, and this becomes kind of ironclad rules, which very often lead to what I call the shoulds, these ironclad rules that are created to keep us safe, help us be good people, help us kind of, stay within the lines. And if we veer out of those and don't obey the shoulds, then that's going to be a bad thing on multiple levels, but it also will probably produce guilt and shame within us.
Yeah. Oh, yes, I'm very familiar with that should. And we also spoke about the shoulds during our loss and grief conversation.
Yes, we did. Yes, we did. And when we get into this, I call it shoulding on ourselves, because it really is, it can become so relentless and so rigid. And there's a certain cruelty to it. And yet it comes from the backstory and these core beliefs so often that say if you don't abide by the shoulds, then you're not going to ever be enough. You're never going to be successful. You will always operate in some incapacity. And so perfectionism very often comes from this. It's how we try to overcompensate for those feelings that I'm somehow not capable. And this sets us up to obviously feel badly about ourselves. And in lower moods, or in stress, this intensifies, and it is impossible to talk our way out of it because it doesn't align with logic and reason. And the more I try to talk myself out of it, I not only feel badly for what started it, but then I feel like a failure because I feel helpless and stuck in it.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So what happens in our response to the outer world is that we get trapped in the story and then can't seem to find our way out. It's like being in a rut, like the pandemic.
Like the pandemic.
Yeah. Dr. Jane, how do we find our way out?
Well, first of all, I want to say that it's important that we not judge our own beliefs, our own backstory, and that we not judge anyone else's backstory. because these were things that merely unfolded in a natural process in our developing self with the environments that we just happen to be in, okay? As luck would have it. So the real way that we find a path out is by being open, honest, and aware of our own beliefs and our own conditioning, and kind of taking it out of hiding, really kind of bringing it into the light. And it starts with living with more awareness, really turning toward what's happening in the moment. It's turning toward and inquiring into, what is my backstory?
Mm-hmm.
How is this playing out in my everyday life? Because it really is like driving, with a rear view mirror.
Yeah.
And the question, even in the pandemic, is a perfect example, is how does my backstory affect my outlook around health and safety and security as we're in these very, very different, unprecedented situations?
Mm-hmm.
And does my backstory allow me to compromise this? And what compromises will I make, can I make, that allow me to feel okay? And so it's also about how does my backstory play into what I talk about as far as myself in this pandemic, in this situation that was overwhelming and seemingly impossible. And how does it serve any greater good? So really turning toward and inquiring in the backstory and figuring out what are the components, letting myself see it, because it ties into, how we operate on a day-to-day basis. Am I operating in accordance to my values? And I mean, our values also come from the backstory, so it's like, what are my values and do I walk like I talk?
Yeah, I love this. Present moment awareness is so important. So the beliefs and the rest of our socialization create the backstory. So where does the conditioning come in?
Well, the conditioning on it has to do with the encouragement, the support, really the reinforcement that we received all along that kept us on track and aligned with the beliefs and values within the environment and within the communities, family, relationships, et cetera, school, that we were developing in. And so the conditioning is really how we practiced and lived out of that belief system, out of what was taught and modeled to us. So it becomes an integral part of our thinking, integral part of our feelings and how we're behaving on a day-to-day basis, really kind of a second nature, which is why very often it's not really clear to us. We're just kind of moving along with it, not really aware of it. It becomes our reality. It becomes our world. This is our world, not the world as it is, but the world as I am.
Yes, but Dr. Jane, sometimes we don't continue to follow along with the family or religion or community beliefs. So what does that mean?
Well, the frames tend to be the interpretation of those external references that we talked about, things that were out there, that activating event, people, places, and things. But within the frames, there are also the lenses, and this is our personal experience. This is what happens to me and how I interpret it that may not agree with those conditioned responses from my backstory. And sometimes we can experience something that's totally counter to the backstory, and we kind of consider it a fluke, and we still maintain our backstory. But then there are these other moments where I take in a new experience, and it's totally counter to what my backstory is. So this new perception totally disrupts my belief system, totally sets me up to kind of experience kind of this falling away or kind of a house of cards, where sometimes I can say, wow, I thought it was this way, but maybe not. And I can suddenly feel that the world is shifting, and it can feel like dangerous territory. And yet can also feel like freedom, because it's turning towards sometimes breaking out of those unconscious agreements. Yeah.
So the ABCs of thinking are straightforward, but it's the backstory that's more complicated and not available to us in everyday awareness. This makes me wonder what's behind some of the things I do, you
Well,
know?
and you know what, Anna? I say good for you because that's where it starts. It starts with us being curious and open and wondering and questioning, who am I? Who am I really? And looking at, whose life am I living? And what's going into how I'm thinking about these people and these places and these situations. And what really, what really is involved in how I'm interpreting kind of that sense of me and them or us and them. Um, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys? And by the way, who said so?
Well, Dr. Jane, this could really shake up the world as I know it.
Well, I want to tell you something. It's a quest of self-discovery for sure, and not everybody's interested in taking the trip. Um, but it's helpful for us to know about the ABCs, even if you don't want to go more deeply into dismantling your belief system or looking at it more deeply. The ABCs all by themselves are an incredible piece, and we also have control over it because I don't have control over what thoughts arise, but if I can turn toward whatever is arising within me, if I can begin to identify it, observe it, without becoming engaged in it, I can make different choices. I can opt to not do things the same old way. I can opt to not fuel the drama.
This reminds me of my favorite 3-minute breathing space as I'm observing my thinking, you know. Is this what you mean by observing the thinking? That
This is exactly what it is. Exactly what it is. As I mentioned before, we're the only species that we know that can really, that has the capacity to be aware of what we're aware of. Okay, we can be aware in a present moment experience. We can observe our thoughts, we can observe our feelings, we can observe our impulses, and we can be aware of what is prominent in the moment, in our consciousness. And with this, it really develops, as we practice it, it develops a very keen sense of an observer self within us that can really take in what's happening in kind of a neutral way. So it's not filled with any particular negativity or judgment, but it's a skill that can offset anxiety and fear and worry because we can see what's happening. We can see what the thought stream is. We can see what our reactivity is all about. But it requires learning some awareness skills, and things like mindfulness that we'll be talking about in later episodes. But it's training ourselves to really access this part of ourselves that is available to us.
well, sign me up, Dr. Jane. And what about the backstory and how do we come to know it?
Well, this requires real an inquiry into ourselves, a willingness to take a look at what our beliefs are, um, to really look at that kind of that book of law that Miguel Ruiz talks about. Reading the Four Agreements is an interesting, starting point for it, quite frankly. And choosing, as we're looking at it, choosing what I want to keep, you know, choosing what maybe I want to let go of, just be opening to the process. But in doing this, we're making a conscious choice. And the conscious choice always comes out of an awareness. And once we're really aware, that can really help us kind of move through resistances because we're asking ourselves, how does it serve me? How does it serve anybody? Staying in this where I am, thinking the way I am, interpreting the way I am, how does this serve anything that may be important to me? So it's about conscious choice, maintaining our intention and our commitment to an awareness, to a path that allows us to be really, really, with these experiences, more fully human, more fully awake, more fully aware, um, through these practices, really, really in that moment of realizing that there's more to life than, this narrow kind of tunnel that most of us have lived our lives in.
Well, this sounds like a big commitment.
Well, it is a big commitment, Anna. It's a life altering commitment. But We don't have to do it more than one day at a time. And it's about learning how to do the present moment awareness and using that as a practice and as best we can, cultivating that observer self that really is that skilled phenomena that helps us discern, what's important, what's not important, really helps us discern that thoughts are not facts.
Right.
They're things, they're mental events, that our backstory isn't the only story, that there might be some other things that can be, added to it or revised, recognizing our past influences. It requires challenging things. But it's not to be pursued with any kind of rigidity or self-righteousness. This is really about standing in a sense of, an honor code of integrity, compassion, curiosity. What is it to be fully human? And trusting that I might be, kind of pulled in this direction just to explore this and empowered to do it.
Mm-hmm. Sort of like these conversations for us, huh, Dr. Jane?
Sort of like these conversations for us, Anna.
Well, I think we're all seeking to do the next right thing for the right reasons.
Yes.
Dr. Jane, this feels like an important piece to know about since we decided that our next episode is an exploration of anger.
That's a hot topic, isn't it? It's a really hot topic.
Yes.
And it is important to know the backstory and to know our interpretation of feelings as they arise, because anger is a misunderstood phenomenon. And to understand anger, we have to be able to own our anger, because so often we want to make the activating event the reason that we're angry. And yet it's bringing it home, knowing the roots of our own anger, knowing the projections of our anger. And very often I talk about anger or any strong feelings as starting with backstory. This is where I write the screenplay, and then I project it out there into the world, right?
Yes.
And treat it like fact. And there comes my justification. So it's going to be an interesting piece, now that we know the backstory, to move into this emotional arena that has, there are a lot of triggers and a lot of opinions and a lot of reactivity.
A lot of reactivity. It's a hot topic right now and very prevalent. So I'm looking forward to our next conversation for the good, Dr. Jane.
I am as well, Anna. Thank you.
I'll see you soon.
You bet.